Welcome. This presentation covers the module on how to prepare and deliver community trainings in the Data for Human Rights curriculum. I'm going to start with some guiding principles that I'm calling I facilitate. And it's for making the trainings that you deliver very enjoyable and informative. And then we'll talk about when and why we do trainings or other kinds of engagements. This could be meetings and workshops, how to prepare and how to deliver these trainings. The goal by the end of today is that you will feel confident and know that you have the skills to plan and deliver a Data for Human Rights training that's informative and enjoyable. Here are the principles that I'm calling I facilitate. This is based on the acronym in English. So inclusive, clear goals, illustrate, facilitate. I facilitate. Inclusive means that we ensure diversity in who is invited to the training, but also who participates in the trainings and other meetings. We want to keep clear goals in mind from the beginning of your planning process all the way to the end of the training. So if you're developing brand new material, you want to have a clear goal in mind before you even start planning the material. And you want to illustrate as much as possible. You might have heard this saying, a picture speaks 1,000 words. It's so true. Illustrating what you want to say rather than saying it is very effective. And this can be done not only with visuals, but also with stories or actually building experiences for your participants. So I think of all of these as illustrating the material. And finally, you want to facilitate. And facilitation means creating a welcoming learning environment, but it also means that you're guiding a conversation. You're not participating in it. So you're going to lead discussions without taking part in them. And you're going to keep focused on how each participant can get the most out of the training or the meeting that you're running. So when and why do we apply these principles? When you apply these principles is at every step of the way in the Data for Human Rights process, whether that's collecting and mobilizing community, whether that's analyzing or filtering your data, whether that's communicating back to the community or with decision makers, you're going to want to apply these principles. I facilitate. The reason that we apply I facilitate at every step is to enable communities to collect, validate data, identify new priorities, plan informed actions based on data, and really shape the stories that are told with their data about the community. And when you do engagement well, you will automatically create a feedback loop, which means that the community will help you identify new priorities, new reasons for collecting more data. You'll hopefully get them involved and inspired to participate in this process. And so the next problem will present itself and you'll be well informed about what kind of data you need, etc. I want to give you a real-world example of how the I facilitate principles play out and make for very effective community meetings and community Data for Human Rights processes. So my fellow trainer, Nisera, works in Nairobi, Kenya. And she, during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, identified food insecurity as a major challenge in her own community. And so she designed a training with myself for 12 different community data collectors to collect data on food insecurity. And we trained people in the tool Kobo Collect. So that's actually one of the modules that you'll find here in the Data for Human Rights training. We delivered essentially that. Once we had data, we analyzed it using summary tables and graphs. Again, those are modules you'll find here in this curriculum. These meetings were presented back to the community, but also discussed with them. So she performed several engagements with the community based on the survey results that incorporated elements of focus group discussions and other things that you'll find in the qualitative section of the Data for Human Rights curriculum. So community were informed about the data that were collected on food insecurity. The feedback was that there were additional challenges, particularly for young women. And there was, of course, these households that were identified that had food insecurity. Many of them were single mother households, widowed households, etc. And so a direct action was planned, which was to provide food relief packages, which continued for several months on a monthly basis for these households. There was also an effort to bring this data out into social media and particularly counterbalance some messages that were coming from the city government about how wonderful job that they did, that they've lifted up the urban poorest by providing food, but the food that was provided was terribly inadequate during these mandatory COVID curfews. And so that was able to be publicized on social media using the data. And to circle back on the new priorities that were identified by the community, a study was designed and run directly by the same group of people in Nairobi, focusing on young women immediately after the food insecurity survey. And so here is how you can apply all of these principles in engagements and in trainings to really motivate community and solve problems. So I'm going to talk about this in the context of trainings today, but just know that the I facilitate principles really apply to all public engagements, whether that's training, whether that's presenting information from a study, whether that's running a workshop so that you can plan something, or performing an action in the community. All of these same principles apply. So we'll focus now on how to prepare trainings and think about how the I facilitate principles apply. So first, as you're planning the training, you want to specify who is going to be invited. And when you do this, name groups that are often underrepresented in trainings or in meetings. For example, women might not be often present at the same level as men. And so make sure that you are specifying to yourself who you need to invite. And then in your invitation, make it clear, say women are welcome. We especially invite women to participate in this training. You're going to state a clear goal to yourself about why you're running this training and what you want people to get out of it. So it's really helpful when you're designing a training to actually write this down. Say, by the end of this training, participants will be able to, and then fill in the blank. The next principle is illustrate. And in the planning phase, you want to identify 1 to 4 skills or specific messages or points that you think will help to achieve your goal, and then illustrate around them. And again, illustrate means creating visuals in your presentation, planning on visuals that you can write on a whiteboard, identifying stories or examples that will get the point across of what you're trying to teach, or designing exercises that give participants the experience and really internalize the information you're trying to teach. On the facilitate principle, as you're planning your training, think about what you need to create a very conducive or positive learning environment. So you want a location that's quiet, you want materials that are printed ahead of time, you want to time it at such a time that you can get a diverse set of participants, etc. Taking those principles and what we just discussed, here's a checklist that you'll want to run through. And we actually have this checklist as part of one of our activities that's coming up next. Before we get there, though, I want to specifically talk about tips for planning some of these illustrations, whether that's visual, audio, or experiential. So the first are slides. All of the data for human rights modules come with a slide deck. You don't have to use the slides. You could also be thinking about presenting your data on a poster after a data collection, etc. But when you have visuals, here's a few principles. And what's really beneficial about having slides and posters is that it's a very shareable format. You can turn these into PDFs and send them over WhatsApp or email. Less is more. You want very simple, clear visuals, limited text. You want to have consistent fonts and colors throughout so that it looks very tidy to the viewer and it's easy to read. And also that all of your visuals and text are presented in an organized, logical flow, and make use of headers to create sections, things like that. Finally, if you're going to be presenting a poster or slides in a public setting, rehearse alone or even hold a practice session so that you can run through everything you want to say and feel confident in it. Time yourself, make sure you're not taking too long. When you do whiteboarding in a training, this can be really beneficial because you have the benefit of a visual, but you're also very easily able to incorporate participants' inputs. But all of the same tips apply for slides and posters. So this means, simple text, simple visuals, And you might actually spend time in a notebook sketching out the visuals and text that you want to write on that whiteboard. There's two ways you can use a whiteboard during a training. One is to accumulate information, almost as if you were designing the poster and you only have one whiteboard filled with text and figures by the time you're done. And you could take a snapshot and that would summarize everything that you covered in your training. You could also plan to have it more like slides where you present a little bit of information with visuals and text, then you erase it and put up some more visuals and text. So just think about how you want to present on a whiteboard. Another kind of illustration are exercises, activities, and the benefit here is that the best way to learn is to involve participants. That's how they're going to internalize this information. So here's some ideas about how you can build in things that are like exercises. You can stop your presentation regularly and invite discussion questions. You can design a step-by-step guided task and then bring the participants along piece by piece when they're learning something new. You could also set up realistic role play scenarios and just be sure that when you do this, you don't put people on the spot and make people feel embarrassed or unprepared in some way. Finally, a helpful way to illustrate sometimes is just by telling a story or providing an example. But stories are nice because they can illustrate your key message while also being memorable, maybe sparking emotion. And this helps keep people engaged. And a good story can even influence someone's beliefs. So not necessarily the most useful when you've got like a technical skill that you're trying to communicate, but if the training is really around behavior change and influencing how people think, a good story can go a long way. And so here's a link to some common types of stories that will help you just think of a story that will be very effective for your illustration. So now I want to pause and we're going to ask participants to actually perform an activity. They're going to plan to deliver module 1.1 from this Data for Human Rights training. And the topic of that module is just an introduction to data for human rights. So people in this module will probably have already been a participant in module 1.1. So for this activity, you're going to break everyone into teams of 4 to 5 people. The scenario is that you're going to be delivering module 1.1 in one of the communities. So if there's several communities represented in a group, pick one of the communities and make it as tangible and real as possible. So in X community, what specifically is the goal, the key skills and messages that they want to communicate? What types of participants do they want to invite to this very specific training? Let's imagine that it's planned in 2 weeks' time. And what's the minimum and maximum participants? Do they need a budget for, say, any food or materials that you're printing? Talk about specific venue options in that community. Talk about particular dates and times that would be accessible for the people they want to invite.